Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Eleanor Janega to discuss the genre of courtly love literature that came about in the medieval era. Dr. Janega is a medieval historian and podcaster. She has written extensively on the topics of gender and sexuality in the medieval era. She has been featured on several podcasts including medievalist.net. She has been featured on both documentaries and TV shows and has done some very impressive medieval movie reviews as of late. Dr. Janega, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I figured before we get started with discussing courtly love itself, I thought maybe we could sort of set the scene for the context of where this genre of courtly love is rising about. So what can you tell us about medieval marriage? I mean, how did medieval people understand marriage, especially for the nobility? Was the focus for marriage romantic primarily, or was it primarily contractual, and romantic love was a secondary concern? Like, what can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, to put it shortly, no, romance was not what it was about. So especially, this isn't true for everyone in the medieval period. So for example, peasants have a lot more leeway because, like who really cares who, you're kind of like passing your salion of land onto. So, there's a lot less stress there. But for the nobility and for royalty in particular, marriage is a contract. And marriage is something that your family in particular are the ones who are kind of like behind. So the church is involved because it's a sacrament, but it takes, centuries for the church even to kind of insert themselves into that one, because the nobility are so sure that this is a function that the families do, like families make this decision for you. Now, that isn't to say that people are necessarily forced into marriages. It's not like they are kind of overwhelmingly wailing and bemoaning the fact that they're going to marry someone that they don't love, because they don't really see that as being the primary thing about marriage. It's just like, oh yeah, well, you get married and you have kids and you pass property and power on to those children. Some people do fall in love, but that's like, oh wow, when that happens, everyone is like very excited and what a wonderful thing. And certainly you may attempt to kind of set things up in such a way that the conditions for romantic love are there. But as a general rule of thumb, no one is expecting that they're going to be in love with their husband and wife. And instead, romantic love, especially within kind of courtly love literature, is seen as being expressly linked as extramarital. So it's like, there's just no way that you're going to love your husband and wife because the institution of marriage is so incredibly unsexy. So like,
Right.
How could you ever possibly really feel that sort of ardor, right?
Right. And then, so then if I can follow up, then how would you say courtly love literature is related, if at all, to the medieval conception of marriage?
Yeah, so I mean, it's like part and parcel of it, because like without marriage, you kind of don't have courtly love, because courtly love is a really interesting genre because it's almost exclusively about unmarried men and married women. So within the way that the kind of the primogeniture system works, primogeniture being the system by which the oldest male heir inherits everything, which isn't like true of every single kingdom across the medieval period, but it's certainly true of, for example, like France in the high to late medieval period, which is where a lot of the courtly love literature comes from, right? So if you are not the oldest son, usually the second son, if you're from a prominent family, like maybe you'll go to the church, something like that. And then if you're the third son, I don't know, you become a knight, right? And, don't get me wrong, these people are rich by anyone's, ability to kind of define that, but you don't kind of come into the same sort of land until later. And so what you do is you go off to another noble's household, someone who's a little bit above you, and you go be a knight there. And so most incredibly wealthy households will have a lot of unmarried guys hanging out and kind of staring at the lady of the house, and like her ladies in waiting, right? And in these cases, a lot of times they've got like older husbands, or they're in these marriages of not to say convenient, but they're in these business relationships. And so they've got a lot of time on their hands comparatively in the medieval period to sit around and write literature about all the things they'd do if they could just kind of get their hands on each other.
Right.
And that's what courtly love literature is. So it doesn't exist without the medieval conception of marriage. But our idea of romantic literature would be like, oh, well, you're gunning for marriage. That's the thing that you want at the end of the day. But no, that's not what they want to do. What they kind of want to do is have these big romantic relationships that exist expressly outside of the bounds of marriage. And they want to see like how far they can get while like towing the line and like not doing something wrong in terms of one's marriage.
I see. So if I can try to wrap my head around this, courtly love is sort of a genre of literature where the theme is very much it's romantic love, but it's typically extramarital
Yes.
love affairs. And it's sort of is it a form of escapism for much of the nobility, or how would you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is definitely that, and it eventually kind of like trickles out of the nobility, and it becomes kind of just popular generally. And we will have books that are the equivalent of like bestsellers in the Middle Ages. So like the Roman of the Rose, like the Romance of the Rose, the Roman de la Rose. Equivalent like to 50 Shades now or something like that, absolute barnstormer of a book. And for centuries people write it out over and over again, and even among the illiterate classes it will get turned into songs and things like that. And the Roman of the de la Rose is essentially an extended it's kind of all about the rose being a reference to women's bodies, and it is a way of kind of talking about how one can conduct these courtly love affairs. So there's that, and that's kind of a form of escapism, just like bodice rippers are now, right? Like people will read romance books and they are all concerned with a duke in a wig. We say bodice ripper because a bodice gets ripped, right? So we're always kind of like talking about the same group of people. Like it still kind of infects our understanding of romance in a lot of ways. But you also have really interesting books, like one of the very famous ones, and that I encourage anyone to get their hands on if they can, is called De Amore, or it's been translated as The Art of Courtly Love. And it's really interesting because it functions in a couple of different ways. Like it might be a satire. Like it might be making fun of courtly love, but that's kind of okay for you and me, because if they're making fun of courtly love, the idea, well, it's so entrenched and people are believing in it so much that like you can make fun of it. So it sort of still tells us something that's real. But also at the same time, it kind of functions almost as like a pickup artist manual, and kind of tells guys how to do courtly love. It's like, okay, well, here's the people that you can do courtly love with, which are all people of the middle class, lower nobility, and upper nobility, and you can do those in various configurations. And it's like, oh, say you're a member of the lower nobility, here's how you pick up a middle class woman, and things like that. But it also has these really interesting things at the back that are called trials in the court of love. And they purport to be overseen by Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughters. Like, probably not. Like, just spoiler alert, probably not. But they bring all of these various situations to Eleanor of Aquitaine to kind of adjudicate and say, okay, well, what if in this situation, who should have to love who? And it's really quite funny because it's like the idea that like you can bring a case of love and it's like, oh, I'm sorry, you've behaved poorly, you have to love that person. Like it's very odd to us. But we know, for example, that at least by the 14th century, right? So this is written back in the 12th century. By the 14th century, people are doing this. So like at least at the court in Castile, we know that they're doing love trials. Like this is something that they think is really fun, and they put these on. So it's one of these things where art might be imitating life in the first instance, but at least by the later medieval period, life is imitating art for sure. And they're putting on these trials and they're saying, oh, who has to love who owes people what? And so it gives us a really kind of good idea of how these guys think about romance.
What would you say are some of those central themes of courtly love literature? I know we talked about how it's typically focused on an extramental affair, how the woman in question is married, the man in question is unmarried, and he's trying to get with the woman, so to speak. Yeah. Are there any other broad themes? I mean, what's the husband doing typically?
Yeah, well, the it's very funny because like like husbands don't kind of enter into it. So I'm like, what is the husband doing? You know, half the time. And I do think that probably, you know, husbands are probably writing love poetry to, you know, other women and that sort of thing. But so you have the unmarried people. One of the big themes, like not to harp on too much about it, is that like you can't be in love if you're married, right? So we have one of the trials that gets brought to Eleanor of Aquitaine. There's a woman and she's in love with a man, and another man is in love with her. And she tells guy number two, look, cute that you love me and everything, but I'm already in love with somebody. And so, look, if it falls through with him, then I will start loving you. And like you see, you're first in line. But, you know, that woman subsequently end up marrying the guy that she said she was in love with. And so the second guy brings her to court and goes, well, okay, well, you have to love me now. You know, because you married this guy. And she's like, the hell I do, you know, like I married a guy that I was in love with. I don't owe you anything. And Eleanor of Aquitaine is like, yeah, no, you got to love that guy because you got married. And so by process of osmosis, like when one marries, like that, all that romantic love is kind of transmogrified into just the legalities of the situation. So she has to give her love to this other guy, and that's what they adjudicate. Another big one is that there's always kind of like an idea of service. So the men who are in love with women are in their service, and they need to kind of think of themselves as always kind of attempting to, you know, as we'd say in England, big up the women in question. So like because you might not really get very much out of this, like, right, you know, you get kind of tokens, but you might not never really be able to spend a lot of time alone with these women. So what you're kind of doing is protecting their image and protecting their reputation and like putting yourself out there for them in any sorts of ways possible. So always kind of thinking about like adding to them. And, you know, getting their favorite tournaments and all those things. That stuff is absolutely real, right? So,
Sure.
but seeing themselves, especially men, being in the service of women here. So it's a process by which the women kind of have the power to bestow love. Having said that, another one of the big themes is that love is always in the process of either increasing or decreasing. Right. So it's like love can never be stable and static. Love is always just about you know, increasing or decreasing, and it increases like ironically if you're kind of like apart from each other, which, you know, you and I might look at that and go, okay, well, yeah, so it increases when you don't have contact with the person and you could just make them into whatever it is you want in your head.
Right.
Cool, right? But like that's like a big thing for them is the idea of this yearning. Like the yearning really kind of increases your love, and when one yearns, one has to kind of like lose weight and be unable to concentrate on things. So love has to be seen as this kind of all-consuming thing. And then conversely, it will then also decrease if you actually kind of like get to spend time with the woman. So there's this really interesting kind of like slut shamey thing going on here where it's like, oh, well, if, you know, you say, hey, I'm in love with you to a woman, they go, oh, cool, I really like you too. That sounds great. You want to make out? It's like, oh, suddenly you won't love them. Right? Suddenly you won't love them because it's too easily gained. So there's this idea that love is a kind of prize that women need to be protecting and only giving away very grudgingly, and men need to be going for at all times. So those are like some of the really big themes that we see, but we also see within this kind of warnings of danger as well, because while this may all be well and good fun for a bunch of rich people who are kind of bored and horny, you know, fundamentally, the medieval world, especially for powerful people, is really upheld by, you know, these marriages, right? And if what you're attempting to do is have a bunch of heirs and pass your property on, you're going to want to be damn sure, right, that, you know, you're passing property on to your heirs and not somebody else's. So in some ways, this can be got around. So, you know, as I say, the Roman de la Rose is kind of like, well, here's all the things that you could do with your beloved that will not result in, you know, procreation. But there are also warnings, right? So if we look over at Aetheriana, for example, you know, Guinevere and Lancelot are in love, and Guinevere and Lancelot end up having full-blown, you know, intercourse that can result in babies, right? And this is one of the things that brings about the fall of Camelot. Right. So there are all these kind of like warnings about what will happen if you go too far. right? It's all well and good to say that you're in love with each other. That is fine, and if you want to do anything short of procreative sex, that's probably okay as well. But you have to really, really worry about tipping over into that bit too far. And so, there are also literary warnings about what the line is and kind of like policing that as well.
Right. I see. Is one of the concerns then about what the medieval people would have understood as illegitimate offspring? Is that
yeah, absolutely. So it's like, and it is of course like super gendered as well, because it's like the worry here is like not if a dude ends up having a bunch of illegitimate offspring, that's fine, right? It's about if like the woman that you're actually married to does that. And we see this all the time. For example, we'll see fines for adultery will crop up, especially in the later Middle Ages. And we'll see, for example, in Italy, there will be fines for adultery. And for men, it's like, okay, well, you have to pay this much if you're rich, this much if you're poor. And the fines are, can't remember off the top of my head, but they're not nothing, but it's not gonna bring the house down. For women, however, the fines are static, no matter like what your place in society. And, let's be real, probably peasants aren't going to bring this to court or whatever,
Sure.
But they're extremely high. They're like really, really incredibly harsh penalties. And it will also state, for example, that those fines have to come specifically out of women's dowries. So, which is kind of a way of saying that like you can't burden the rest of the household with this, because dowries are often kind of earmarked for women's own personal spending. So there's a lot more pressure on the women in these situations not to get found out committing adultery than the men. And for men, it's like, oh, you can have a little adultery as a treat, provided that you can afford it. It's sort of like, something that men can have, but women can't.
If I can then follow up with maybe discussing the historiography of courtly love literature, has there been any sort of shift in the past decades with regards to our understanding of courtly love? As I understand it, it was typical of like the early and mid 20th centuries medievalist historiography that they'd sort of emphasize that courtly love was more platonic and less explicit and romantic. Can you say anything to that?
Yeah, definitely. So earlier on, especially kind of coming out of the Victorian period and into the 20th century, it was basically saying, oh, this is all spiritual love. It's like the big thing. So they would really kind of emphasize the fact that these things are all kind of about ideas of love, so a certain extent that is absolutely true, right? So the idea that your love increases when you don't see a woman, that indicates a kind of love that is never going to be physically consummated and can't be like, it's completely kind of divorced from the realities of having an actual physical person in front of you. And so I'm not here to say that doesn't exist, and that's definitely part of it. However, we are now of the opinion that people were absolutely getting it on as part of this.
Right.
And, that's not to say every single person, but at least some people. And we see that in a lot of different places. So in the first place, you'll see it, like, for example, in sermons, where you will see, especially kind of in the 14th century, places like that, when you have the Black Death, there is a lot of kind of finger pointing as to why God is punishing the world with the Black Death coming about. And one of the things that we repeatedly see from preachers is they're saying, oh, well, it's all the adultery. It'll be the adultery, right? And it's, people dressing up very fine and having sex with people that they ought not to. And so God is punishing us by bringing the Black Death on us all. That's one way that we see it.
Sure.
You also see it in places like penitential literature. So penitentials, which are a really cool source, but you have to be kind of careful with them. So they're written by priests kind of as handbooks for other priests. And so it's kind of saying, okay, well, here are, in one way of looking at it, is like, here's the penances that you'll give when someone comes into confession and says, bless me, Father, I've sinned, I've been committing adultery. It's like, oh, what do I do for that? And it's
Right.
It's this many years of fasting on feast days, and you've got to say this many, Hail Marys, that sort of. There's a lot less of the Hail Marys, a lot more fasting in medieval penitential literature. We'll just say that. But what it also does is it gives you kind of questions to ask people when they come into confession, if they're kind of like, like, well, here's some ideas. But we have to be kind of careful with penitential literature because they're written by priests, right? And who knows if these are necessarily questions that reflect what's going on in society, or if they reflect kind of the more lurid things that people who have taken a vow of celibacy might think that other people get up to.
Right.
Having said that, if you're at the level of the clergy where you're writing penitentials and people are paying attention to them, you probably come from the nobility. Right? Like you are probably one of those second sons and you're sitting around being like, oh, my brothers are, what are they up to? And like, that's kind of like what you're writing about, the world that you see and reflecting on it. So we certainly know within those that there is a lot of worry about adultery and seeing that come true. And I mean, also like fundamentally, sure, it could be about spiritual love and no one's saying that doesn't happen, but, in the dire warnings, for example, of, Guinevere having sex with Lancelot, that's something that certainly happens. And, again, going back to De Amore, Andreas Capellanus, who wrote it, he's saying, yeah, like here's like what you do when you want to consummate love. And he expressly equates love with consummation.
Okay.
So he says, for example, that peasants are incapable of love, right? And he says that they copulate like beasts. And so if you think that you're in love with a peasant, you're not, and you should just have sex with them, right? Whereas when you are engaging in courtly love, you've got this kind of like refined romanticism, but also sex. Right. So, he's really explicit about the fact that sex is bound up with it. Now, again, that could just be him making fun of people. It might not be, to be played with a straight bat. But if he's making fun of people about having sex, then that means that people are having sex, right? Like it doesn't work one way or
Sure.
another. It has to be both those things. So certainly we do now think that people are kind of getting up to it. And again, there are readings of, as I say, Roman de la Rose, we kind of see this as kind of like a sex manual for when PIV is off the table. And things of that nature. So we have moved on from that. But, part of the reason that we've moved on from that is that, our understandings of sexuality are becoming more refined. And, now it's more okay to study sex as a serious field of inquiry. I'm not saying it's great, like we still really struggle to be taken seriously, and you still get a lot of flack for it, but it is becoming more acceptable to treat the study of sexuality as a serious one. And there's a lot of people who have done wonderful work on this, like Ruth Mazokaris. All of her books are absolutely amazing. I'm a huge fan of her work. And I'm of course like coming up with a blank of all these authors that Brundage, absolutely amazing work on sexuality. Thomaset and Jacquard, we're now really coming to this point where in the kind of later 20th century, so kind of like from the 70s onward, we started having all this really amazing work on it, and we're kind of building and building. So we're in a really great place now, I would say, in terms of work on sexuality.
If I can maybe follow up to what you said earlier, that some of courtly love, like De Amore, is sort of a pickup artist, an artist. Yeah. How seriously did medieval people take certain elements of courtly love literature? Like in De Amore, there's kind of misogynistic, kind of rapey elements of it, and it's like I have a quote. Had a quote at one point. I wonder. Okay, here's a quote from it. If you should by some chance fall in love with a peasant woman, be careful to puff her up with lots of praise, and then when you find a convenient place, do not hesitate to take what you seek and to embrace her by force. Like, it's really rapey stuff, and you gotta ask, did they take this seriously? Was it satirical? Was it a mixture of both? I mean, what can we say to that?
I mean, yeah, so it's probably, we have to say, a mixture of both, because one of the things it could be satirizing there is, rich people's relationship to the peasantry. And that is certainly, a real issue. Peasants are not treated as fully human. Here, like obviously peasant can just refer to any farmer. That's what it means technically. But, here reading between the lines, probably what we're referring to are serfs. So as 75% of the European population in the medieval period are serfs, which means they're unfree. They don't get to make decisions for themselves. Like you technically need to apply to get married. You can't just move if you want to. There are all these kind of restrictions on you. I mean, you're not a chattel slave. It's not as bad as things will be later, but it's not great. And I certainly wouldn't sign up for it myself.
Right.
And So an attitude like that towards the sexuality of women there, and women are already kind of conceived of as lesser beings. So for example, in less hostile sources, you can look at Thomas Aquinas's attitudes towards rape. And so he's a 13th century philosopher and theologian. And the way that he thinks about rape and the way that he speaks about it is not as something that is done to a woman. It's not kind of like a violation of a woman. It is a violation of the men in her life. So if a woman is raped, then the rapist should kind of make amends by making it up to whatever man is seen as having kind of dominion over her. So you rape a woman and she's unmarried, you owe her father money. Right, like, so you owe her father money because like she could have maybe fetched a higher bride price. And like one of the ways that Aquinas sees a way of like being made whole after rape is, well, you can marry her, right? So if you like rape a woman, then we'll just marry her and then no harm done, right? And that kind of like transmogrifies the crime into something that's all right, right? So conversely, what you and I would call consensual sex, right? So if a woman sneaks out of her dad's house and goes and has sex with someone because she wants to, Thomas Aquinas is also going to call that rape if her dad doesn't like it. So that rape there is kind of something that's done between men. So whilst this is certain, it could be tongue in cheek about, how the nobility think about especially women of lower socioeconomic orders, it's also kind of reflecting the reality of like, oh, well, no harm, no foul, because, can you really offend, a peasant girl's husband or father, right? Like, is that really possible?
Sure.
So it does reflect like incredibly misogynistic attitudes towards
Sure.
women. And, this is also kind of bound up with the fact that for medieval people, women are very much seen as the sexual gender. And like women are the ones who are seen as kind of like being insatiably horny and like impossible to kind of rein in. So it's sort of like, oh, well, a peasant girl, if they're not refined, if they haven't been taught these things that the women of the court have been taught in terms of, safeguarding their sexuality and safeguarding themselves, like, can you really like actually offend them or harm them at all? Because everybody knows that like women love sex. So to kind of go for it, right? And it plays into those preconceptions about gender that we see.
It's interesting that in the medieval period, whereas maybe today we sort of see it as the reverse, that we see men as sort of the more amorous, sexually active types, but in the medieval period, it was kind of reversed, where women were sort of seen as more prone to sex.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of these things where there's a lot of reasons for that. And this is ancient, actually. It goes back to like, Aristotle would have told you the same thing. Plato would have told you the same thing. And it kind of goes back to ways of thinking about sexuality. So interestingly, in the kind of ancient and medieval standpoint, sex is something that is bad. I mean, like, obviously we still kind of think that now, but to a certain extent, it's still much more true of the ancient and medieval period. And the thing that kind of horrifies both ancient and medieval philosophers alike is what they kind of see as a loss of control around sexuality. So one of the things that's like really terrible and humiliating for them is the fact that they'll feel horny, right? It's like, oh, this is not what I want. I want to be this logical guy who's kind of like cut off from any thoughts of sexuality. And I just want to have sex in the best possible way, which is just like to have children. And I want to keep my mind on, philosophy and the state, like for the Roman state, even among the pagans, there's a real concern about kind of conserving your male essence and making yourself a good citizen, a good member of the Republic, or even like a good just member of the Roman imperial apparatus who is focused on logic and doing the right thing within those circumstances.
Sure.
And in those cases, if you have too much sex, it's seen as depleting for men. So there is a kind of direct link in their minds between semen retention and masculinity. And so it's kind of like, fellas, is having sex with a woman a lot gay, right? Because the idea, and there's a literal concern that if you are having too much sex with women, you'll become like a woman. Because you're kind of depleting your own essence. And then conversely, women will sort of become more masculine because the friction of sex will warm them up. Women in humeral theory are seen as being kind of cold and wet, whereas men are hot and dry. And the friction of sex makes them more warm, and so they'll become more masculine. And so it's like you don't want to like be giving them all the sex that they want, because who knows, then they might start getting ideas and thinking of themselves as people, right? And that would be bad, right? So that is kind of like the pagan interpretation of that. Medieval Christians, what they like to do with classical philosophy is say yes and, they're very much kind of like improv guys about the whole thing. So they say, oh yes, all of that is absolutely true, plus the fall of man from the Garden of Eden,
Right.
which we know to be true now that we are Christianized. So Eve's willingness to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge is expressly linked to sexuality. So, the understanding of nakedness is linked to lust, right? So St. Augustine, for example, writes about this, and he says, well, one of the things, like what gets them kicked out of the Garden of Eden isn't necessarily their understanding that they're naked. What gets them kicked out of the Garden of Eden is they understand that they're naked and it makes them horny. So they see each other's genitals for the first time in a sexual way. And it's that lust that it stirs that's the problem. It's not necessarily like understanding yourself as naked. It's understanding yourself as naked and sexualizing that. And so Eve's willingness to eat the fruit of the tree is kind of a signal of all women's interest in sexuality and openness to it. So like the eating of the fruit is seen as very sexual. And oftentimes you'll see in the medieval period that linked to a seduction. So they'll say that she is seduced by the serpent. She falls victim to her lust before lust even exists. And because Eve is the model woman, all women kind of fall onto that edge of things. And then it's, the bog standard stuff, all of the humoral stuff, plus, and also, women are bad. And so if a thing is bad and sex is bad, right? So the ideal human for medieval Christians is one who doesn't have sex. You should go be a clergy member, right? Like you should be a clergy member and you should never have sex. And that's what God ideally would want. Obviously, sex has to exist because people need to be made, but a really ideal human would eschew sex, would focus on religion. And it's all women's fault that we can't do that. And so obviously women are the ones who are kind of obsessed with sex, right? So women have to kind of take up this position as the foil to what is good. And if sex is bad, then women must like it.
I see.
It's different. It's different.
Well, it's different, but you can also sort of see, especially with some of the pickup elements, it's sort of kind of trickling down to our own contemporary approaches to gender and sex, and maybe we'll get to that later down in the road. But if I can maybe then ask, with all of this backdrop of Augustinianism and the sort of church's sacramentology, how did the church really feel about courtly love to begin with? I mean, I know that a lot of these authors of this courtly love genre are themselves clerics, because I think the author of De Amore, Andreas
Capellanus,
I think he himself is a cleric.
Yeah, that's what his name means. It means like Andre the Chaplain.
Oh God.
So which is quite funny, because it's one of these things like within the like, is the satire or isn't it? Because he begins by saying, oh well, I shouldn't know, like I do know a lot about love even though I'm a priest, right? And like I've had all these opportunities. But then in the book he says, but nuns shouldn't do this. Like it's okay for priests but not nuns. And they're like, okay, so it might be satire, right? And there is a good reason why that might be something that is satirized, and that's because look, the church takes a dim view of courtly love, right? Because of course they do, because the church's line straight down the middle is the only time that sex is acceptable is specifically for the getting of children within marriage. That's it. And even within that, there should be limitations in order that you don't fall prey to undue lust. So, we'll have all kinds of clerics and things say that, it's even a sin to be too turned on by your wife. Right? Like if you are enjoying sex too much with your wife, like that's a bad thing. You should not be doing that. And we see people say, for example, that it's a sin to love one's wife as though she were your concubine. Right? Like so to be really horny for your wife, that's a sin. And similarly, if you get married specifically because you really want to have sex, that's also a sin. Now, it's fine to get married because you want to have sex and you're like, there's this very famous line, it's better to marry than to burn. And that can be interpreted in two ways. One is it's better to, if you really can't ignore lust, right? Like, and it's preoccupying your every waking thought. It's better to get married and have sex and just kind of expiate that, so you've got some kind of time in the day to think about something other than sex. All right. The other one is, it's better than to burn, in that it's better to get married and have sex in the illicit way than it is to go to hell for all eternity because you've had a bunch of the sort of sex that you shouldn't be having, right? Having said that, you need to like be then kind of reining it in. So it's like there's all these times when you shouldn't be having sex. Like you shouldn't be having sex, for example, on a Saturday night, because if you get too turned on by all the sex you have and then you're horny in church the next day, that's bad, right? You shouldn't be having sex on holy days of obligation. There's no sex during Lent. There's no sex during Advent. And having said that, no one really listens to that. Okay. Right, because like if you're not supposed to have sex during Advent, then that would mean that nobody in the Middle Ages was ever born in the month of September,
right?
And like that's definitely not the case, right? So
or Lent,
or Lent, yeah. It's like, so yeah, okay, like cool. So no one's born in December then, right? Cool, right. Interesting. So like there's what the church says and what people do in relation to the church, and then also what members of the church do, because we have it on great authority that plenty of them are having sex. Yeah, like they're not supposed to be doing it, but they definitely are. You have plenty of crackdowns on clerical issues with celibacy. We will see priests who have concubines really openly. That's like one of the biggest complaints that we see from members of the laity across the medieval period, is them basically openly having wives, when they're not supposed to. We know that priests see sex workers. There's a lot of complaints about that. We have a lot of like periodic crackdowns within monasteries and nunneries where monks will be having sex with each other and nuns will be having sex with each other, and people will go in and be like, "Look, guys, you've got to knock it off. Like, come on, we're trying to run a monastery here," and we will have nuns who run off to have sex. So there's a Joanne of Leeds who in the 14th century, she makes a fake cadaver of herself, pretends to have died, and like runs off with the guy. God. So yeah, I know, it's great. It's really wonderful to see. So we have all of these examples of clergy members behaving badly. So sure, they don't like courtly love, and yeah, saints, literal saints, right? Like Aquinas and Augustine will tell you what it is you should and shouldn't do. But Augustine had all kinds of sex before he became a priest, and before he became a saint. So for him then to like he got to have his kicks and then say, oh, but by the way, you shouldn't do that, right? So it's all very funny and silly, because there's what the church says and what people do, even members of the church. So the church can try really hard, but basically they spend the majority of their time just being like, please stop having sex. Oh God, oh, you're doing it again. Oh, come on. And yeah.
Right. And if I can maybe also ask, would they have seen it maybe as a necessary evil in the way that a lot of the clergy will see sex work and prostitution? Because I know that there's a tendency in folks like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas to see, okay, we can will the common good whilst permitting certain evils like prostitution to arise, and that's okay. It's not ideal, but it's kind of just the way that.
Interestingly for us, right, as far as the church is concerned, sex work is a lot better on the list of things than courtly love is. Right? Right. Because it's sort of like, well, but then it's also kind of like sex work in terms of like the right, the right way of doing it. Like for them, interestingly, sex work should really only be undergone by people who are unmarried. So it should only be unmarried men who are soliciting sex workers. It's more of a sin to see a sex worker if you're married, because it's like, you have a perfectly good wife right there, sir. Like, what are you doing?
Right.
But sex work is this really kind of liminal activity. Like no one is like, oh man, I just love sex work, I think it's great that it's happening. I believe that what Aquinas says about it is, it's the cesspool that keeps the city of God clean, right? So it's like, that kind of tells you what you need to know. But the thing about sex work is that it is seen by them as a much more kind of transitory state. So the way that we tend to think about sex work now is like, oh, it's the worst thing that could ever happen to a woman. And once you become a sex worker, like that's it, your life is over and you're forever stained by this having been a thing. Whereas for the medieval church, they're like, well, yeah, sex work might be a thing that a woman does for a while. And then when she's done with it, she can leave that behind her and kind of like rejoin the Christian community. So if you get tired of being a sex worker, ideally what the papacy advocates is that you go get married. And if you go get like married and like start a family, then bang, like that's what your penance is.
Okay.
Like that's literally your penance. In the later medieval period, there are also like whole dedicated orders of nuns that spring up to kind of service the, you know, women who want to do this. So like there's the Magdalens, for example, quite famously. Now, having said this, it's a really strict order. Like they are not joking. They're like, you're about to do penance for having been a sex worker. And it's like they do a lot of corporeal punishment. But there are also other groups, like the guy I wrote my PhD on, Jan Milic of Kremžiž, who's working in Prague. He starts an order. It's like he gets in trouble for it being an order. He says it's not an order, but he's definitely living with a bunch of reformed sex workers. Like, let's put it that way.
Sure.
And one of the things that he does is he'll like pay off sex workers' debts if they're doing sex work because they're in debt. And then if they want to kind of like live a quasi-religious life, they can hang out with him and like he'll preach to them every day. So it's like, and people love, like the people in Prague were like, this is great. We really like this.
Sure.
But his rivals who are like, he's getting a lot more donations than us and we don't like this. They take a much dimmer view of the situation, put it that way. So he ends up in trouble, but like, it's like, is it heresy? I don't know. Like he gets off, so it's fine, really.
Sure. Well, okay. So we've kind of got an understanding of how the church sort of felt about courtly love, but was there any criticism regarding courtly love literature from the nobility or at all? I mean,
yeah. So it's really interesting because we do also see backlash from the nobility themselves, where they're like, this is frivolous and you guys are being incredibly naughty right now, because it is naughty, right? And it's also, one of the big criticisms is, exactly like we see criticisms of romance literature now, right? Where it's like, this is a kind of feminized thing that women are enjoying and it is not serious. And like serious stuff is like philosophical contemplation and the works of the kingdom and things such as this. So there are always killjoys. And one of the things here is like, again, it's like, oh, well, why are you all sitting around like reading girls' books? You shouldn't be doing that. And you definitely shouldn't be like encouraging people to cheat, right? Like that's bad and not good. So there are always kind of voices that'll say like, this is not good, but the reasons kind of vary. But one of the big reasons is like, well, this is feminized. And we don't like feminine things, where we are all very serious here. Yes, indeed. Having said that, those are kind of outlier voices. And like most people are like, I like that. And you'd be surprised, like for medieval people, their sense of humor and their kind of interests are much bawdier than ours are. So, we see all kinds of things. So for example, if you look at fabulots, which are great kind of literature, again, like big at French court, they're like expressly bawdy stories that you tell at banquets and things like that. And they're all about sex. They're all about sex and fart jokes and, things like this. And, when we think about kind of refined culture, we're like, oh, they would never. Like that's a thing that simply could not happen. But really, for them, they've got really different understandings about boundaries and things. They live in a world where privacy is like incredibly different, right? Like they all kind of sleep in the same room. Like no one's got a bedroom. You're a lot more used to seeing other people naked, like being in the room where other people are having sex, things of that nature. So for them, these things are a lot more ambient, and the way that they think about culture is really different. So certainly pushback against these sort of things exists. There's always some member of the nobility who's gunning for sainthood, or who is trying to encourage his daughters to have good marriages and like shun these kind of things and think about Christ. There's always a lot of Christianity going on. All these things are happening within an expressly religious context, but the great majority of people don't really care. And they're just going to go for it and they're going to have fun.
So we see that courtly love, it's a genre of literature that pops up, 12th century, 13th century, and so on. But was there ever maybe a shift in love poetry that occurred at all in the medieval era? I asked this question, I'm a little bit biased myself, because I see that in some of Dante's poetry or Petrarch's poetry, especially Dante's works, the comedy, the Commedia, you really see that there's an emphasis more so on platonic love, divine
Mm,
love, idealized love. Like Beatrice kind of becomes a symbol of
yes. Yeah.
like divine love to Dante. Do you see at all a shift in love poetry at all
So
in medieval?
that's a really interesting question because it's like, Dante, he's so interesting because he has kind of like this perfect love that Andres Capelanis is talking about in De Amore, where it's like, he saw Beatricia like what, twice, three times,
Right.
and he was like, and I really love her, and it's like, do you, homie, do you know anything about her? But he's built her up into this kind of like form of divine love, and so it's quite interesting because what you could say there is what Dante's kind of done is he's taken, these elements from De Amore, like the ones that are probably most acceptable to the church, and he's refined them and he's gone for it, right? Like he's like, yeah, that's what love is. So it is kind of very much a process of kind of discarding the sexualized elements around courtly love and coming up with, yeah, the spiritual love, exactly as you were saying. And that certainly exists. Having said that, we also kind of see, for example, people like Chaucer, right? And so Chaucer's not writing courtly love, obviously, but by the time we get around to the Canterbury Tales, he is making fun of courtly love by kind of transposing it into situations where there are common people who are kind of like doing the same thing. So, for example, the Miller's Tale in the Canterbury Tales, he's focusing on, what we would see as like a traditional courtly love pairing. Like, Alison is married to her much older husband, and she's very beautiful, and she has extramarital affairs with the young men living in their house, right? So it's taking the same kind of courtly love things, but putting them on commoners. So it's like, oh, there's unmarried men who live in their house. Oh, but instead of them being knights, they are apprentices who are paying rent. So it's kind of like, oh, like mocking, how common people are doing these same things. And Alison kind of lives up to all the idealized forms of beauty that we see in courtly love literature. Like, she's blonde and she has arched eyebrows, but she plucks her eyebrows. And so that's how you know she's vulgar, because her eyebrows aren't automatically like thin and arched. She does it herself. And she's kind of like overly dressed in like all these fancy ways. So she's dressing like a lady, but she isn't a lady. So in a way, what we can see this as is a rebuke to how courtly love literature has now kind of like shuffled down to the common people, and now common people think that they're nobles, right? It's like, oh, the dog thinks he's people, right? And they think that they can have these same kind of extramarital affairs, and that their lives are the same as those of the nobility, when clearly they're not, like these silly peasants, right? So we have kind of like two things happening, where in reified eras, like Dante, one of the greatest poets ever to live, he's able to like perfect and make this form of spiritual love. But then at the same time, you've got Chaucer, who's like going the body route, and what he's doing is really satirizing this, and the fact that it's now kind of trickled down to a level in society where it's been effectively perverted.
I think that we've covered mostly pretty much everything that I've wanted to cover. If I can maybe have some sort of concluding thoughts. Do we find any sort of equivalence maybe between courtly love in the medieval era and our own sort of contemporary society or dating culture? I know that I don't think you're the first or the only one to compare the De Amore as like an artist pickup line. Like, I've heard a few other people describe it like that.
Oh yeah, because it's like you can't not, right? But in terms of courtly love, you see it all the time actually in rom-coms. And so there's a trope, for example, in rom-coms that is called disposable boyfriend. Okay. And the disposable boyfriend trope comes up over and over and over again in movies, where like oftentimes it will be the girl is with a guy who's not good, and like the guy who's in love with her, it's kind of like, a process of like her shedding that boyfriend throughout the movie in order to kind of like get to like what romance is. So we're like, we see that all the time in movies. And or think about, for example, one of the go-tos that I always bring up here is Love Actually. And in Love Actually, you've got that love triangle where Natalie Portman is married to one guy, but his best friend is in love with her. And then, he shows up at the door and he's like, pretend it's carolers. And he says, oh, I really am in love with you. And they make out, right? Okay. Like, that's courtly love. right?
Okay.
Like that's courtly love, where it's like where he expressly says, maybe I'll be in love with someone else, but like for now, to me, you are perfect. And it's like all that is courtly love, is like,
Right.
oh, I'm reifying my best friend's wife, right? And like
Right.
until I can find another placeholder for this. But it certainly exists. For example, Notting Hill. It's got a disposable boyfriend character in it. Julia Roberts' character he's married to your man there off of 30 Rock. Alec Baldwin. There you go. She's married
Okay.
to a Baldwin, and like she's got to ditch the Baldwin for Hugh Grant. It comes up all the time, like all the time in movies that happens, and that is a direct relationship to courtly love and seeing romance as a competition for kind of like the interest and love of women, like that we still have that as a holdover in our society, right? Is this hell, even in the Twilight books, it exists where it's like, there's this woman and like men are kind of like vying, exactly. Oh, like I cannot with those. But it's still kind of like about like this woman and like her purity being upheld and like whose attention goes where. And that's very much playing on these same kind of tropes about romance. And so these idealized romances where like no one is actually in love and no one is actually treating each other like they're people. It's just kind of
Sure.
objects. But we've got a lot of it still. And I think that's why it's important to kind of take a look at courtly love and kind of take a look at the fact that this is, it's not actually healthy to like be really jealous of the person that you're in love all the time. Which is one of the things that courtly love is all about. It's like, oh yeah, you should always be jealous. You should always be like seeing yourself as in a fight. You should always like look at yourself as like love increasing or decreasing. These are massively unhealthy views of romance that we
Sure.
really still believe in. And, we should kind of take a look at them as what they are, which is, products of a really weird form of literature that like should be critiqued and probably jettisoned.
Sure. Sure. Well, then, do you have any book recommendations for those who'd want to continue researching courtly love literature? I know this question might be a little tacky because I asked this question at the close of all my podcasts. Okay, do you have any fun like book reads you'd recommend?
I really, really recommend De Amore. Get it, read it. Like that is a fantastic piece of work that you will never stop loving. Not to toot my own horn, but I've got a book on gender that is coming out in January this year, which is called The Once and Future Sex, and we deal with some of these things.
Gotcha.
Kathleen Forney has written a lot on courtly love, Forni. And her work is really, really wonderful, and I really recommend checking her out. So she's got a book called The Chaucerian Apocrypha, which is really fun, and it's got like a lot of Chaucer things, and her analysis is really spot on. So I recommend her as well. But yeah, those are great places to start, I would say. And yeah, like there's a lot of really interesting work being done. But if you're going to start somewhere, start there.
Dr. Eleanor Janega, thank you so much for joining with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It is absolutely such a pleasure to rant about my favorite stuff.